Invited to leave for their worship with Julia, and they'll join us again in the Eucharist. I'm actually going to come a little closer. I feel far away from you. This is one of those weeks where I need to feel people close to me. I feel like what always happens is like the front of the sanctuary is always sort of empty. Yeah, so if you feel so inclined, and if you would like to be nearer to me, you could also come a little forward. All right, nobody is taking note of that. All right, you can stay where you are. Oh, thanks, Thomas. Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, thank you, Naka. Thank you, Bet. Thanks, Julia. So in 2015, I was visiting my parents who live in Korea, and I was looking at this new photo book that my dad had made where he was chronicling his younger years when I came across a photo of my grandmother in North Korea. And many of you have heard me share stories about my dad over the years and how he was separated from his family as a child during the Korean War. His parents and his younger siblings stayed in the north while he and his older siblings went to the south, never imagining that what they thought was just a temporary separation would become permanent as their country was divided between the communists and Korea's allies. So CJ, if you could put that photo up. This is a picture of that page. And you can't really read it, so I'm going to read it to you, what he wrote. He wrote, Mother, Sul Yi-jang, 1907 to 1997, had 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. She was industrious, strong, spiritual, committed, principled, and very wise in practical things of life. She survived with 5 older children gone to South Korea, 2 in 1948 and the other 3 in 1950 during the war, while 3 daughters and 1 son remained with her in North Korea. They were young, 9, 7, 5, and 2 at that time. My father told her not to send me away to the south with the others, but on November 30th, 1950, when I just came home, in from outside playing, saw 2 older brothers and sister ready to go somewhere. My mother simply said to my older brother, "Take this boy with you." And I left with them, not knowing where we were going. I was 11. Ever since, our family has been separated between North and South Korea. It has been 60 years already. So I was stunned. I've heard my father's story many, many times, but I had never heard this one. That my grandfather didn't want to send him to the south because he thought my dad was too young for the journey. That my grandmother would defy her husband's wishes, which were unheard of for a Korean woman of her generation. And what that must have been like for her as a mother, with communists bearing down from the north, when protecting your child from danger means sending him away from you into uncertainty, into unknowing. And it made me think about what a mother will do in grim times because of love. When there are larger powers and forces at work that you can't control, that you can't guarantee, the protection of your child, like in those moments, what is a mother to do? So I thought of my grandmother as I read our Old Testament lectionary reading this morning from 1 Kings. And 1 and 2 Kings, if you haven't read them, chronicle the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. And it's not great. It's not great. It's like good king, bad king, good king who then becomes bad king, and then like really bad king. It's just that like over and over and over again. And it's a familiar human story of greed, ego, deceit, war, violence, power struggles, and the suffering of innocent people as a result. And then in chapter 17, the chapter that Colin read for us, it goes from these huge headline stories, these larger political realities, and it zeroes in on this very small, intimate story of a mother trying to keep her child alive during a time of famine that was brought on because of the evil and idolatry of King Ahab. And so the Lord tells the prophet Elijah to go to Zarepheth because there's a widow there who will feed him. So Elijah goes there and he asks her for some water and some bread, and she says, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." So this is a woman who sees clearly the grim realities and the world that she is raising her child in. She doesn't have her head in the sand. She's not pretending that things are not what they are. She doesn't lack faith. She is facing reality. And she knows that when all you have is a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil left and nothing after that, you starve. That's just what happens. And so she's doing what any loving mother would do in that situation, what she's always done every single day of her life. She's feeding him. She's making dinner, their last dinner. Now remember that Elijah is a prophet, and prophets really just have one job to do. They listen to what God tells them, and then they do it, and they leave the results up to the Lord. Sometimes people listen, sometimes they don't, but they are there to say what the Lord has told them to say. Now, if I was Elijah in that moment, I would be like, you know what? That's okay. No worries. I see you're in a hard spot, and then I'll just show myself out. That's what I would have done. But instead, he says to her, do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake out of it and bring it to me. And afterwards make something for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the jar of flour will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. Now at this moment, she has a choice. And she could have said, you've got some nerve asking a poor widow for bread. Elijah's telling her that her jar of flour and her jug of oil will not fail her, but she doesn't know that. She can't see the road ahead of her. There's no guarantee that these jars will be filled. So what is a mother to do? Well, what this mother did, the scriptures tells us, she went and did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as her household, ate for many days. The jar of flour was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. What was going on in her heart and mind in that moment? I imagine that it was something akin to my grandmother on November 30th, 1950. The only thing she knew for sure was love for her child, trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of her ancestors. Just enough strength and courage to make a little cake for someone who is asking for food. Fighting, as I think of my grandmother, that temptation to run after your son as you see him walking away from you. This has been a hard week. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and grief after this election. And as I read the story of this widow and this mother, I just kept thinking about my grandmother. That for both of these women, they had no control over what was happening in their larger world. They had no voice in their political system. They had no vote to cast. But what they had was fierce love for their children, trust in the God of their ancestors, which doesn't mean that they weren't afraid. Like, of course they were afraid. But fear did not dictate their actions. Love is what dictated their next faithful step. One woman made a little cake out of the poverty of her resources, and another one let her son go. I've been thinking a lot about our ancestors lately. Last Sunday was All Saints' Day. And as I think of them, I think about how their lives are our inheritance. You know, our inheritance is James Baldwin saying, "I have never been in despair about the world. I have been enraged by it. I don't think I'm in despair. I can't afford despair. I can't tell my nephew, my niece. You can't tell the children that there is no hope." You know, it's Fannie Lou Hamer saying, "If I fall, I will fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I am not backing off." And it's ancestors like these where their light illuminates our way in a time when it can feel really dark. But remember, they weren't always our ancestors. At one time, they were us. They were living, they were loving, they were struggling, they were fighting. You know, their generation had different and similar crises, like evil kings, power struggles, war, division, and violence. But what makes them different from us is that they finished the race while we are still in the middle of running it. You know, we don't see the jars of flour and the jugs of oil that never fail. Like, we don't see that. We just see the little bit that's in there. And we are still gathering sticks for what we think is our last meal until someone comes and asks us to feed them. You know, what will we do? How will we respond? We take the little that we have and the little that we can do, and we offer it, you know, trusting God with that outcome, whether we live to see it or not, as we act and as we do from that place of love. So on my father's birthday, you know, that year after I saw that photo book, I posted that page with my grandmother's picture on it on Facebook. And actually, CJ, could you put it on the screen again? I just want to see her face. And so what I did was I thought about, you know, what would have happened if she didn't let him go that day? And this is what I wrote. I said he would have never met my mother. He would have never met Dick Holder, the US soldier who taught him English and nicknamed him Professor, giving this North Korean refugee boy a vision for his life that he could have never dreamed of for himself in that moment. The American pastor that he translated for might have never sponsored him to come to the States to study. He might have never received the call to pastoral ministry while studying there. Thousands of lives would not have been changed through his ministry, writing, and leadership over the years, too countless to name. And last but not least, I would not have been born. You know, not everyone gets to see this outcome, and God gave my grandmother the grace to see her son again, 37 years after she let him go. You know, that he could tell her the stories of what had happened. Actually, what I should have done, and I didn't think to do it until right now, is, you know, you see the moment. That's a whole other story that many of you have heard already, of how they were miraculously reunited in the late 80s, and that she lived to see his face again and to see what God did. And not everybody has that chance to see that. But I'm grateful for that grace that both my grandmother and my father had before she died. And so, you know, I'm not even sure. I have to confess that as I was thinking about this Sunday, I was really like, I don't even know what to say. To be honest, I don't even know what to say. But I felt like when I read about this widow, and as she reminded me of my grandmother, that there is something about these lights that we can draw on to give us strength and courage for today. Today I asked Julia DeLashmitt to bake our communion bread for us instead of those little styrofoam wafers, just to remind us to have real bread for communion, just to remind us of this story, to remind us that what that piece of bread represents is the living bread, foreshadowed in the story of the widow, but ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. The bread of life that gives life from generation to generation to generation. I remember, I think Michelle, I don't know where she is, but Michelle Howard has a yeast starter that has been in her family since the 1800s. Can you believe that? They've kept it alive for 200 years, is that right? Yeah, maybe 150, 200 years. And it's been fed by each generation, and it feeds each generation. This is the story. This is our story. So this morning, I invite you to consider, where are you in this story? As you put yourself maybe in the place of the widow, where are you right now as this narrative unfolds? Maybe you are there just gathering the sticks, and you think to yourself, this is it, this is the end. We're gonna eat this last meal, and then we die. Maybe that's where you are this morning. Maybe you're at that point where a voice is saying to you, even though you feel like you have so little to give, make this little cake and offer it to this person in front of you. Maybe you're at this place where you're already seeing the flour and the oil flowing, you see that and you're believing for that. I think we're all across the spectrum. But there's an invitation to say that this story is part of our inheritance, and we need to embrace it. Rodney and I were talking right before service, and he was telling me that this past week he was going to email me and Leisha and just say where is God in this? Where is God in this? And I think this is where we see God. This is where we see God, not only the living bread, but the ways in which our lives are that yeast that is then needed throughout the whole loaf. And I was telling Rodney in particular, I was saying, Rodney, I hear people saying this and I feel this to my bones, that I think especially people like you, artists, creatives, poets, the writers, the musicians, we need you guys right now. We really do. Right now, actually, even sermons don't speak to me, and I'm giving you one right now. Sermons aren't really speaking to me. It's that those spaces and places that can hold the complexity of it all. And that's bread for me right now that I'm feeding on. So I'm just going to give us a moment for us to, you can bow your heads, you can close your eyes, you can just even sit and gaze at these ancestors that are depicted in these windows around me. Just to say, where are you this morning? And how is God speaking to you through this ancestor of ours, our sister, this mother who took the step of faith to just bake this little cake for someone who asked? What's God inviting you into